Aye, kuwe kuamadue.
Aye, kuwe kuamadue.
Aye, kuwe kuamadue.
Aye, kuwe kuamadue.
My name is Christopher Martin Darby. I've been a member of the Brotherhood for a little over 2 years. Currently one of the co-chairs of the Education Committee, and it's been such a good experience being part of the Brotherhood. So yeah, excited to be a part of this process as well.
Great. Let's start with where did you grow up?
I grew up right next door in Berkeley, California. Born and raised, born at Alta Bays Hospital, raised just south of the UC Berkeley campus.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was it like growing up in Berkeley?
It's different. It's a really interesting place to grow up. I think both of my folks are from the East Coast, Midwest. Mom's is from Chicago and DC. Dad is from Connecticut and New York City, from Jamaica, Queens. So they found this place. This was a new spot for them. And I think for them, coming from the East Coast, coming in the late 60s, early 70s, it was a really dynamic place. And they had to learn that. And I feel like I just was born into that. So what was wild for them was baseline normal for me. So I think it definitely endowed me with an understanding of different cultures and different peoples coming together, where there are tension points there, where there's solidarity and overlap. I grew up, again, pretty close to the UC Berkeley campus, so in a predominantly white neighborhood, so not in South or West Berkeley where most of the black folks were. So that, I feel like that intersection of race and class, growing up middle class, was pretty formative. And Berkeley as a container for that was really interesting, because there's all this kind of just in the air, in the water, is this talk about diversity, talk about differences and accepting each other, and a lot of it performative and just talk. And there is a baseline there that I feel like exposed me to different ways of being at an early age. So growing up in Berkeley, it was never like, this is how everyone does it. It was like, oh yeah, they do it like that, and they do it like that, and you know, some of it is cool and overlap. Some of it is they just do that over there. But very early, it was clear that there's no one way, there's no one right way, and I think that has shaped how I see the world and how I move through it.
What were some of those influences as a child and as you were growing up in Berkeley that, you know, I guess as you were trying to speak to that in terms of seeing as people do things differently? Yeah.
I mean, you had cats who, we had, you know, black nationalists. We had the Panthers in the mix, and the kind of generation after that. We had the kind of the kids of hippies, like white hippies, peace and love style. We had folks who were super into nature, and you know, our East Bay regional parks here are amazing. We have green spaces. We can get into that and explore that. We had some folks that would never get dirt on their Jordans and would never think to walk up in those hills. And you know, going to Berkeley High, it's only one public high school for the whole city. So you get that big cross section of folks. And again, just seeing, like, it's a big high school as well. It's like, at least when I was there, it's like 3,500 students. And so there was no single hierarchy. Mm-hmm. Like, yeah, you could play football and you could be the star quarterback, and 3/4 of the campus doesn't know who you are. You know, you could be the baddest cat in this set, and on the other side of campus, no one's ever heard your name. So there was, not to say that there weren't tensions between folks and people weren't trying to position themselves in a certain way and power over dynamics, but it wasn't, there was no singular hierarchy. So there was more room for people to kind of be in their zone doing their thing, and in a lot of different ways. That cut a lot of different ways. Yeah, I feel like that's a vague answer to your question, but it feels true to form.
Okay. Well, let me ask this. Oh, good. Just to follow up on that, where did you fit in amongst all these different groups at Berkeley High? Like, where'd you come in?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I came in from a small private school here in Oakland, St. Paul's by the lake. And so I came in wide-eyed and like, okay, coming from a little pond, coming to a big pond, let me orient myself and see what's going on. And I have an older brother who's 3 years older, so when I came in as a freshman, he was a senior, and that was a very nice anchor. I was able to hang out with some of the older cats and get some cover, really, was what it felt like. So I had a little bit of kind of social juice and with my older brother on campus, but I think when I really think about it, I think my navigational strategy at Berkeley High was overall like sports. I was like sporty spice. So I had my little like rip away pants, and I played on the soccer team all 4 years. And I think that was enough of an identity where it didn't blend into the cats who were, selling drugs or kicking it super hard, although could like go and mix it up with them a little bit. Racially, it was really interesting being on the soccer team. That it was a pretty diverse team, and Berkeley High, I think to this day, but definitely at that time, was pretty racially segregated, just in terms of socially how people would move on campus. So playing on the soccer team meant that I knew a lot of Latino cats. And so that meant that, like, literally I could walk down a certain pathway or up a certain set of steps that other folks would avoid because they didn't know them, and it could be some tension. So that opened up a whole kind of lane of Berkeley High to me in some of those relationships. So that was beautiful. But it was, it has a feel of a New York City in a way where people are kind of expecting some wild thing to happen, and like some people might stop and look, but other people are like, oh, well, that's New York. Like that's how right. Berkeley High felt. So there would be all sorts of things going on in the hallway. There might be a fight there. There's someone getting hot and heavy with someone else over there, and like navigating it, I was thankful to be as tall as I was in the hallways. That's all I have to say, because I could just at least check out the numbers on the doors, and I'm going there, because all this activity is going on. But one of the things I think it really helped me with, and it's, how do I say? I think I had a strong foundation at home, so and two parents who would advocate for me if they needed to. So I felt like I had a solid foundation, and from that solid foundation, that adventure was fun at moments, and it was manageable for the most part. And with that, it gave me a lesson in navigating bureaucracy that I don't think you could replicate in a functional educational setting, so my junior year, when we had no principal and something like 6 or 7 vice principals, and we're trying to navigate to get something done, paint a mural on campus, knowing that that vice principal is not the door to knock on, but this one, we might be able to get something done, and learning that the receptionist, if you're in good with them, they know what's going on behind the door. Yeah. So be cool with them, and you might not even need to talk to the person behind the door. You might get what you need right here. And so little things like that where, again, it was dysfunctional overall, and that meant a lot of kids were pushed out of that school or slipped through the cracks, as the school would probably narrate it. So it definitely had a shadow side as well. But again, to have a solid foundation to be able to jump off into that situation with, it was a really dynamic and a space filled with lessons.
I hear that. And what would you say, or who or what influenced you the most, you say, as a kid or as you're growing up? Would it be your parents, maybe your brother? Possibly the mic.
Next question.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Oh, yeah, let me put it under your thing so you can
All right.
talk with your hands.
You said who?
Who or what influenced you the most as a kid? Or,
Yeah.
because you did mention just having all these different dynamics around you. Is there maybe someone in particular, maybe, whether it's family or whoever, like, was there someone that you felt like, okay, they get this,
Yeah, I mean, family was a huge home base for me. I have mother, father, little sister, big brother. That was our household. And I think especially because we were a black family in a predominantly white neighborhood, that as I navigated the world, that was my home base and touch point. Like the dinner table, really. I feel like that was a place where, one, you're expected to be. Like that was one of the unspoken rules for the most part. Sometimes it needed to be spoken, but it was pretty well understood. And that was understood to be a place where, you could kind of come in a mood or come quiet or whatever, but for the most part, it was, how was the day, what happened, and so that was a space where I think I made a lot of meaning making, made a lot of sense of things. Again, having an older brother who was navigating some of these things a little bit ahead of me, felt like a kind of a great luxury. I was able to see through his eyes and through his steps and missteps, like where the walls were, what the parameters were in our household, out in the world, and what could run you into issues, what could make for some smooth sailing. So yeah, I think my family was that primary touch point. And then the neighborhood I grew up in, pretty randomly, there was a large cohort of boys about my age. Most of them were a year older, and like myself, a handful of them had older brothers who were 2 or 3 years older. So we had a little fight gang. I mean, from young, and we were close to Emerson Elementary, so that was like, that's the blacktop. We're out there playing football, basketball, and at that point it wasn't a lot of soccer, home run derby, but like that group of friends, I feel like how we moved through the neighborhood. Sometimes I'd like try to explain it like Sandlot or something like that, where it's just like a little bit old-timey throwback of like meet at the park, and then we'll kind of figure out where it goes from there. But exploring the city on bikes, getting into this and that at a pretty young age, especially with the older brothers around, hanging out at 7-Eleven, hoping they would come by so they could buy us beer, and like getting back on the bikes and rocking it. So I feel like that group of friends, I watched the Warriors game with one of them last night, and so that was a big influence. And then sports, played a lot of sports coming up. So Jerry Rice was my number one hero coming up, and looked up to that dude, and just like getting very active, like whenever there was a dull moment, trying to be out playing something. So yeah, those are some of the influences, especially from the earlier side, before I was really getting into books and some of the more intellectual role models, which came a little bit later.
I hear that. Around that, just as you're getting to, some of the intellectual role models and other people around, you spoke about just even having some of this experience being in a predominantly white neighborhood, even though, South Berkeley, West Berkeley, other places, had a much, larger black population, or majority of folks was living over there. What were some lessons that you learned, just, I guess, around your community, that you may have gotten later because of where you were living, or you had to, either travel to, or, just have experience with other people that lived in a different area?
Are you asking about the neighborhood? I grew up in the black community in general.
Community in general.
Okay.
Yeah, community in general.
I think because I was a misfit in some ways, either like racially when I was in middle class settings, or class wise when I was with mostly black folks. And I think that piece of there are different ways and different strokes for different folks. So I've been, again, a misfit in that there I can navigate and have a real good time and real good relationships in different spaces. But never feel all the way at home in any one of them. And that's something I think that continues to this day, basically. But what I think it opened my eyes to at a pretty early age is, again, there is no single way to go about things. And I think that with community in general, that give and take of how does community allow for that, and either whether that be like supportive, and again, in Berkeley there's a rhetoric of diversity, whether what the reality is and how that meets it is a different story, but so some spaces really try to amplify that as a value. Other places try to tamp down on it, but still will leave space for a little release valve of like, oh, well, that happens over there. We don't talk about it much. We don't look much. But you see how even those spaces that are more taboo, or we don't talk about, it still has a really important social function, And so I think the community mechanics, or the dynamics of how a community comes together and expresses their values, that was something that I think I had to tune into from a fairly early age, because again, I couldn't just be in the space and expect that I could kind of fall back into it, be understood, understand everything, and just be 100% comfortable. There was always some stretching or bridging that I was doing in those spaces for the most part, and with the exception of on the sports field or on the court, where I just felt like I could kind of be.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And just, you mentioned earlier, going to school, I think, on the East Coast for college, and what was that experience like as as you're going? Because there are, some similarities, like you mentioned earlier, in terms of how New York operates, and as you mentioned, like Berkeley High, like some of those dynamics about people will respond to certain things, but they expect some level of activity will be going on. So, some people go, how'd you feel when you went to the East Coast?
Yeah, it was a whole nother trip. I really enjoyed my time. I was in New York City for the most part. I was an undergrad at Columbia University, so I was uptown, which I really loved. Like I don't think I would have done well. I had some friends down at NYU, like in what felt like more hardball city, and that was fun to go visit, but it felt disorienting. But one good thing is I do have fam in New York, so I have an aunt, I have a handful of cousins. My grandpa, who's passed since, was in his early 90s at the time, out in he was like in Jamaica and then moved to Little Neck, so I would like hop the LIR out there and go see him. But it was one thing I came to appreciate and didn't come in with necessarily, again, because I'd visited New York a bunch, like
Right.
not every couple years to go see my family. So that wasn't super foreign to me or super new to me. And by the time I went off to college at 18, I'd had the opportunity to travel to a handful of spots, including internationally. So I'd had like experience in different cultures and and I didn't allow for that with New York. I thought it's within the States, it's a place I've been a bunch, blah, 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 blah. And so some of the cultural differences, like not weather aside, like some of the cultural differences just were something that I really had to get used to, like the language. Hella fools, that's what we say out here. Like, call someone a fool in New York and see how that goes over. Other way around, kid. Like, yo, don't call me kid, don't call me son, I am not your child. Like, so there's just little things like that. And then also, like, what's polite, what's rude. In the Bay Area, a cat will like, yeah, I would hang out sometime, blah, blah, blah. And then it might just never happen. New York will be like, well, I'm gonna hang out with you, son. Like, just like straight up, they'll just tell you. So, like, there were little things like that. And then in the schooling context, Columbia University, Ivy League school, founded before the Union, and King's College, like a level of wealth, a level of whiteness that I had not experienced out here. I mean, I thought I knew rich people, they got a house in the hills and the uplands here, like, it's a different thing. Maybe that switched up with the tech and all that since then. But I mentioned that at Berkeley High, one of the big things as an upperclassman, we painted this mural. Like, we started the Campus Beautification Club. We thought we were freaking the system. Like, okay, we'll call it the Campus Beautification. We knew that there was this graffiti abatement coming from the city council. So we were like, okay, yeah, if we want to stop kids from tagging on all the walls, let's give a dedicated wall for these artists. It's a beautiful project. Mural still running at Berkeley High. And when I showed up to Columbia, I remember looking around and being like, oh, they're not going to let me paint on these walls. They're not going to let me paint on these walls. So yeah, it was a different style. And I was like continue to be, but like real California kid, so how I talked, how I held myself, smoking weed out there when they will arrest you and send you to Rikers, So like that was like, oh God, this is a whole another style. So it was just a lot of adjustment and then the weather and that's like, it seems straightforward enough, but let me tell you, brother, as someone from out here, I don't know how it is the other way around, how you've been liking it or not liking it, but it was a kick in the ass. I mean, there are some beautiful days, but that winter, I was miserable. I was miserable. I don't know how else to put it. Like, I got through it, and what I realized a couple years in, when I quieted my own complaining down enough to hear the other people. I was like, wait, y'all are complaining too. Like, y'all don't love this either. Like, well, how's this? But the seasons, we got the seasons. Yeah. All right. Like, the birds nest at different times here. Like, it gets darker earlier at different times here. We got seasons. We just don't have that season. So anyway, it was an adjustment in many ways. But I think around actually that same timeline, after a couple years, and granted I'm 18, 19, so figuring things out, but like when I realized it wasn't necessarily about, the Bay's so much better and the New York's so much better. Because I go back, I remember coming back my first winter break here and coming back to California, and me and a buddy who were going to NYU missed a handful of parties, a house party. Because we were like, oh yeah, we'll get there at 11, it's like we're on New York time, and we show up, and we're like, we're shutting down, like where y'all been? And So I was like, oh yeah, New York's better because you stay out late. Oh, California's better because you get Mexican food. And then I like quieted that down enough to be like, wow, what a privilege to be able to spend time in this amazing and dynamic space and this amazing and dynamic space. And so once I kind of turned that corner, it unlocked it in a way where it's like I can be at the West Indian Festival and before school starts, and then I can come back here and be a Dia de los Muertos or whatever, and just have these counterpoints that just rounded it out and made it sweet. But it took some time before I got to that.
Yeah, well, it's always nice to have experiences at kind of different cultural touch points. Just given as you gave those examples around the festivals and parades and things like that, and just the differences season-wise and all that. So you get the kind of both coasts. You get to see how they work and operate, and how people work and operate.
Yeah.
Which that can you can learn a lot from that. And just around that, I wanted to expand out a little bit, just make it more general. From your experiences and from going to school on both coasts and having that, going back and forth, overall, and you mentioned you got to travel as well, what would you say being Black in America means to you?
Yeah. I saw this question on the page and was like, wow, that's a rich one. Being Black in America means a lot of different things to me. It means some semblance of a shared history, I think, and a collective consciousness that is in part born of that history. I think we, here in the belly of the beast in the United States, like individualism, especially fueled by capitalism, like the ideal is this idea, some self-made billionaire, I guess these days. I was gonna say millionaire, but that doesn't cut it these days, apparently. And that phrase always makes me chuckle as an educator, where it's like, how are you self-making it in those first 3 years of life, friend? Like, right. What language were you using? How did you find your own meals at that time? What networking were you doing that made this possible? It's like our comparative advantage as a species is our empathy. And we're pretty well useless for the first 4 or 5 years, practically speaking, in terms of taking care of ourselves. So I think that one of the things that Blackness in the Americas, and especially in the United States, is an understanding beyond that narrative. And I think as we get like more to the critical consciousness piece of it, it's an understanding that actually that capitalist individualism is antithetical to our way of being, which is not endemic to us as Black people. I think it's more of an indigenous way of being that I see across many cultures. But there's mutuality, there is shame and taboo, so there are kind of cultural guardrails. Right. And I think because of our history in the Americas as Black people, a painful, tough history of oppression, we have had to develop some sort of collective consciousness, one, to struggle against some of that oppression and movement, but two, to just cope. So whether it be navigational or transformational, like that understanding of we, and that, and how that we comes with like the sensation is like a warmth in my chest. There's like a somatic, embodied feeling of connection, and that connection doesn't always come from the best places. It's, because we caught hell together, most of the time. But what we've been able to make out of that, and again, what a potent antidote or other way of being to some of the dominant culture ways in this country, and again throughout the Americas, where we have black folks in kind of parallel situations. It's so clear right now that that type of consciousness is so needed to kind of deliver us from this nexus of crises. So it feels even more relevant. Like, there are times where I think culturally we can talk about music, we can talk about sports, where black folks have this juice that is so potent, and it can be used frivolously, I think, and it can be, talk about sports and entertainment, it can be directed to ends that are more individualistic and more capitalist and kind of prop up this system. But there's always an undercurrent of subversion there as well that I think, if I had to like put my finger on another adjective, there would be like, there's always a countercultural piece of it too. There's the double consciousness. Like, we see more angles of the thing, because like we've been told we want the boot, we've had our necks under the boot, we've seen it from that angle, we have an appreciation for the contours of that boot in a way that someone who wasn't looking at it from those different angles would have,
or has never been under a boot.
Exactly. So we couldn't tell me what the treads look like, but boy, the top of it is real nice, and we want to aspire to. Like, okay.
Yeah, that's very real. And just based off of that, what would you say are 3 things, or maybe the top 3 things that come to your mind that you feel have been the most harmful to our community?
Yeah. I think runaway capitalism is right up there. And I'm no economist, so I couldn't tell you 100% and parse it, and this is exactly what it is and what it's not. But so the runaway piece, I think, is important there. But this idea of profit over people, which is how many of my ancestors, many of our ancestors got here, and it's the racial bribe, which has put a wedge between us and working class white folks and working class folks of other races. So I think that this form of capitalism, and again, I'm trying to leave space, maybe there is a toned down, more humane form of capitalism that would not be a scourge of black people throughout the Americas, but for sure what we got is, I think, one of the most insidious ills that we face, because we've internalized it to such a great extent. We live in this soup, so that part that we can't shake, and then externally, like how much brutality can be justified along the lines of profit and professionalism and some of these other hallmarks of capitalism. So that's got to be one. I want to say climate crisis is another.
Interesting.
And I was reading this article the other day by this brother, I believe his name is Hop Hopkins, he's like the head of organizational change at the Sierra Club. So
Okay.
Bless that brother for jumping into that.
Yeah,
But he wrote this article called, I believe, Racism is Killing the Planet. And his basic hypothesis is one of the reasons that we're in this climate crisis is there have been these, I think what he calls sacrifice zones, where industrial polluters are allowed to do their thing. You can dump in that neighborhood, you can emit in this neighborhood. And he says he's connecting the dots. You can't have climate catastrophe without these sacrifice zones. You can't have sacrifice zones without like a deep other, someone we throw away people, disposable people we don't care about. And you can't have disposable people without racism. And I would contour that a little bit. I think throughout history, there have been disposable people without racism. I think in our modern day and time, that is the number one justification for throwaway people. And so when I think about how black people and other people of color are disproportionately impacted by the fallout of climate disaster, I think of how I was just looking at, they got the thing going in Glasgow right now with the climate summit, and saw a graphic of the United States is something like responsible for 24% of historical emissions or something like that as a single nation. So again, where we sit and the racist and racialized country that we live in is a leader. We're the leader. We're like a leader in like global white hegemony, and we're a leader in emissions. And I don't think those things are disconnected. But I think that where we sit with the climate, one, anybody can get it. And so like as we like wring our hands around race and gender and sexuality and politics and like the wave is gonna come and take all those arguments with it. And so it feels like it is not only our problem, but in terms of its existential threat to us. And if we back that up even more, like, we're a land-based people that were taken from our land. So our relationship with the natural world, our ability to observe a creek over years and say, something's going on here that might not bode well for our community who depends on this water. And that has been, I'm not gonna say taken from us, because we've retained so much, we've learned so much in a new environment. But how our relationship to tilling the soil has been strained and alienated through chattel slavery. And I remember seeing a video of this brother who's an educator in Philly, and he's doing urban gardens. And he's like, they bring out groups of black students, predominantly black students, to come work in this garden. And he said to the camera, every group of students I get, someone cracks a joke about slavery. We're out here picking something or planting something. So if our relationship, again, to the land has been tortured in that way, and if our access to the land has been circumscribed, from getting snatched up in Africa to the USDA's policies, we are not going to have our 10 toes down and grounded in the natural world in a way that we're going to be knowledgeable, nimble, and kind of resilient enough with those natural systems to protect ourselves. And then our political marginalization in a lot of ways, because it's not all out and out of disempowerment. We have so much power. But that means that the concerns of our communities, including environmental racism, are not being heard or heeded. So that would be a second one. And then the third one I was thinking of, and I'm always try to be kind of cautious on the blame the victim style, but if there's one thing amongst us that I could kind of stir the pot with, it is that critical consciousness. Because we've been catching hell for hundreds of years in this hemisphere. And one of the differences or watersheds to me in that are the times where we have community and critical consciousness or we do not. Because you can be in a real tough situation, and even, let me back that up. the situation I described earlier was not a super tough situation that I was in growing up, right? But I was like navigating white spaces, trying to make sense of it, and it was hard as a kid. I had that dinner table at my house to go and make sense of it and have that touch point that, like, you're not crazy. This is what it is. Here's a little history. Here's how I navigated it in the 50s, 60s, 70s. That's what it looked like then, and this is what it looks like now. So just, again, was able to make meaning, feel heard, feel held. And I think that on a larger scale, on a community scale, when we have that, we can endure a lot of stuff. A lot of stuff can happen to us. It doesn't necessarily transform the material realities, but we have a narrative we can access that isn't 100% deficient. This, this deficit lens that we're looked at with through the eyes of white supremacy or white America or whatever it may be. And if we lose that, or when that becomes strained or alienated, we don't have access to that other understanding of who we are and why we are here or why this situation exists, then we're just adrift on this sea of materialism and capitalism and white supremacy, et cetera, et cetera. So I feel like, kind of come what may, if we have the space to understand ourselves, define success for ourselves, instead of turning on the fucking TV and going with whatever is on the moving pictures, like, then we can do a lot with a very little. And as soon as that kind of collective critical consciousness goes or wanes, all these other things that we face, white supremacy, capitalism, climate catastrophe, whatever it may be, we're hamstrung. We're in a much worse position to be able to react, respond, transform those conditions. So, yeah.
No, that makes a lot of sense. What would you think, or what do you think are some ways, I guess, you can fix some of these issues? I mean, yes, large scale capitalism having such an impact on us, but even on, kind of a more regional or local basis from things, do you see any maybe solutions or something that you feel like is leading in that right direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think on a basic level, we need to turn towards each other instead of away from each other in crisis. And I think that, as I was mentioning earlier, I think as a people, we are a model for that in a lot of ways. And even though we're always maligned and black on black violence and this, that, and the other, like, there's so much more to that, or than that, to the narrative. I mean, like, that, again, that collective sense, and that, what are we gonna do? Because I think overall, and this is black community, any community really, I feel like at this juncture, if we're so polarized and it's a us versus them mentality, and that's the dominant paradigm, it won't work in terms of getting to this next round of this evolutionary game or whatever. So I think, and within the black community, first and foremost, because we have some common history or we have some shared identity to give a basis to that, we turning towards each other and looking to cooperation and looking to just see each other through a lot of messaging and a lot of structures that would not only have us apart, but competing against each other and kind of buying into some of the crabs in the barrel logic and rhetoric. As an educator, I believe in the power of education very much. I think like not all education is created equal. That's one of the Steve Biko, like one of the most potent tools in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. So I think there are, schooling as we know it in this country and throughout the Americas in many ways is still a colonial project. And so that's not to say that any type of education is good. But I think from basic literacy, so we can, read the signs and read the text of this world. And I know for me, that is how I was able to bolster my understanding of Blackness, even when I wasn't immersed in a Black community. Because I was reading Huey Newton, I was reading Marcus Garvey, I was reading Fred Hampton, and I was listening to the words of Angela Davis, like those elders and ancestors, and just being able to access their thinking. And like as a kid seeing, Huey Newton all buff and like that's the image and he's a badass Panther and all. You read the brother's stuff and he has a very detailed Marxist analysis. It's like, okay, I didn't get that from the pictures and the posters. Like that pride part and that strength part is part of it. And the brother was dealing in some real political thought. And so, those were parts of my journey growing up where, because on the other side I have people, why do you talk white or something like that? And I'm like, I'm listening to Brother Huey running it down in standard English, you know what I'm saying? And connecting with his people. And I'm like, those are not mutually exclusive. And I will never give up my ability to speak multiple dialects of English because I outsource that, or I say that's the white people's province. Like they are the masters of that domain. Like, nah, I can speak standard English. I can write standard English better than most of them. And I can also speak in other ways. How many dialects of English do you speak? And that's an asset, not a deficit. And so I think I lost track of the whole question, brother.
No, you asked about solutions, and yes,
that's right.
that was, you were still on track. You were still on track.
Yeah,
Like,
so
I was following.
All right, not all education is created equal, and so I don't want to just put out a blanket like, oh, just education, but again, in terms of cultivating that critical consciousness and who we are and knowing our history, and in terms of, again, having the tools. And I should say, like, these days, I don't think the educational project is like, look, young version of us, like, let me tell you the ways and do as I do and you'll be good. It's like, let me try to give you some context, endow you with some critical thinking skills, and hope like hell you find a better way than we did, because we are accelerating off a cliff right now in terms of culture, economy, politics. And so it has to be more of a co-creative process with youth or whoever. I'm like, shouts out to adult learners. I don't want to just cap it at youth, but I think if one of our biggest challenges is keeping that collective consciousness lit, then education has to be one of the pillars of how we kind of approach, understand, address our current state.
I hear that. One of the things you said earlier, you talked about, especially within the Black community, we should be turning towards each other versus away from each other. Yeah. And I see that connection and the parallel when we talk about the Brotherhood of Elders Network. Because that it's all about that level of understanding that community, bringing folks together, to achieve a certain goal. And I'm curious, how has the Brotherhood of Elders Network impacted your life?
Yeah, it's been a really good impact. I think it has, especially, and I remember I said I've heard about the Brotherhood for many years. I've had friends and comrades who were involved, but really only got involved a little over a couple of years ago, and it's been a hell of a couple of years. So to have somewhat of a political home where I know there's some level of shared analysis. I don't have to explain what I mean when I'm saying, these systems or that process is set up not to serve us. So there's like inefficiency there, and I think we have to worry about like false consensus. I think sometimes we can say, oh, you know what we mean, and no, we might all of us have different definitions. Right. So it's been I think somewhat of a political home, a space of camaraderie and connection. It's been a platform for organizing and doing some work that, especially within the education committee and some of the brothers we have there, starting to put some collective action together and some collective strategy together. Because I think in the network there's great brilliance and amazing things happening, and we're not always as coordinated as we could be. So to feeling the kind of energy when we're able to sync up some of that activity has been really powerful. And then I think the intergenerational structure has been amazing. And meeting folks like Baba Cole and getting to soak in some of that wisdom and hear again what came before, what are some through lines, and not just in some like documentary or some book. Like, it is live and living color, and so to be able to establish some of those relationships and deepen in that type of connection. Because again, coming up the way I did, I had my family, I had good friends, but not all of that was always moving towards like Black freedom movement. And so to have elders and mentors who are so clear on that, again, I don't need to explain or where I'm coming from or what I'm thinking or that reason for being, and as the mission states, like the furtherance and benefit of Black boys and men, and I'm not super hung up on the boys and men part. Like, if it said Black people, I would be just as with it, I think. But in so much of my work in the education world, it's been like, okay, and what about the Black students we're working with? How are we engaging Black families? Blah, 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 blah. And so like that is just the starting point with the Brotherhood. It's so gratifying, inspiring, and just focusing too, because it's just, and we're working on improving this definitely in the education committee, but we got brothers coming in who, you step into that space, it's like, whoa, have you ever been in a space with this many Black men? Have we been talking about things like this, like how we, interact with each other, how we appreciate each other, how we recognize the intergenerational power here, so just stepping into that space and then trying to cultivate it. So after you get that feeling, here's a way to plug in, brother. And what do you got going? Oh, you're into health? There's a subcommittee for that. Oh, you're into education? There's a subcommittee for that. So to kind of operationalize some of that warmth and collective feeling I spoke to earlier about what being Black in this country or this hemisphere is, it's the so what. Okay, so what? Now what do we want to do now that we're here? And I love that prompt. I love that challenge. And it feels much less lonely in the context of the Brotherhood, and knowing that from different walks of life, from different angles, this is a space where I feel like I can want to put my best foot forward in a way where I know, I try to put my best foot forward in like white-led nonprofit organizations, and you run up against certain things, and so when I put my best foot forward here, not to say that we don't have challenges and organizationally it's all super dialed, but like, there's a certain level of trust and there's a certain level of investment where it's like, I want to see this thing continue to thrive. And that feels like a very reciprocal relationship.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. What would be some advice you would give to your younger self?
Which younger self?
Which younger self?
I think that there would be a element of like, trust your intuition. And I think some of the unlearning that we have to do in this country or this hemisphere is like, what feels right or feels wrong. There's something that we get and some pinches or constricts in our body or something like that. And then we have all this messaging about that feeling doesn't exist. This is good. Don't worry about that. Get rich, go to Disneyland, get a Mai Tai on the beach, whatever it may be, where it's like, and I knew that wasn't quite, but everyone was just, and I feel so grateful that, again, between my family, my community, the experiences I've been able to have, traveling, playing soccer on this team, whatever it may be, like I have had enough sense of self-worth, and I've listened a little bit to myself. Like I have kept an ear out. I haven't been completely cut off from that. But sometimes I'm like, yo, if I were more explicit with myself, if other people around me were more explicit of like, it might not make sense. Mm-hmm. It might not be a great fit in some of the structures of this world, but it doesn't make it wrong, and you're on to something. And I think that that's something that like going back to that education thing, like when we're in a power dynamic with a student or a youth where I think I have the truth and I am imparting that on you, I'm not going to leave a lot of room for like, what's that intuition you feel? Follow that. Because you know what? It's like classroom management is harder if you have like 25 kids who are all like, nah, my thoughts and feelings matter. And like, I'm not into how we have to sit like this and face forward and listen to this lesson about X, Y, Z. Mm-hmm. So I understand why that doesn't happen kind of practically in a lot of spaces. But I think we're in a place where we need to be co-creating with intergenerationally. And here's some wisdom I have, here's some game you have that, fuck, I don't know how to use the internet like that. What'd you find out? Like, how are you thinking about social connection? Mm-hmm. And I think that our social, political, economic, environmental mix that we have is based on so many oppressive structures and justifications for that. It's just so, it's like a house of cards. And if we tune into our own intuition more readily and more frequently, some of these things that is like, how do we contort ourselves into this weird shape to serve this culture? We'll be like, oh no, we shouldn't contort ourselves like that. We should be like this. And that might mean that some of these structures need to fall off because we won't fit into that little box. And so I think I would tell my younger self, like, tune into your body. Your body is a compass. It's not just a tool to manipulate things in the world. Like it can tell you things. and there's deep cultural wisdom that you've been alienated from that is some of those more explicit lessons. So like look into that. But even if you're just making the road by walking and following what feels right, we will net out better than where we are right now, and some of the cultures that we have to deal with that are so harmful.
Okay. Last question. What advice would you give to a younger generation? And as an educator, you're constantly talking to younger folks, but is there anything in particular that that stands out to you that you'd want to impart for advice?
I think it would be similar. I think it would be like tune in with yourself. One of the frames that I use a fair amount in my work these days is compassionate curiosity. Like lead with some heart and ask the questions, that curiosity and that inquiry, and when you put the compassionate with it, that's a very human inquiry, and we can get behind some of the shame and blame with you interpersonally, but intrapersonally as well. Why did I do that, or why do I act like this? And then we start to, if we can ask that question in a more generative and gentle and kind way to ourselves, like, yeah, why do I? What is that pattern about? And I learn a little bit about my history or okay, that makes a little bit more sense. So if we can, again, lead with intuition and add a dose of that type of compassionate curiosity, and know that even though the things are as they seem right now, they don't have to be this way. And so what you're listening to and what you're experiencing and hearing in your own self, that's as valid as what this fucking TV commercial says, and probably more so. So like lean into that and get curious about them both, honestly. But if you're curious about, why when I witness this type of power dynamic, do I go like this? Interesting. If you follow that thread, you can get to some transformative places. Instead of, let me quiet that down, because like I don't want that, so let me just. So yeah, I think I would tell a young person to tune in with yourself and know that we're all navigating this, and it's all, there's so much uncertainty, and that's part of it. You know, we're part of this larger and more complex set of systems, and there's like great mystery there, and so that's cool. And when we follow our compass, we'll probably end up in better spaces. And again, in this hemisphere, in our history here, that might mean like we're under pain of death sometimes if we step out of line or step out of our place that's been prescribed for us. But that type of physical death is not the worst outcome either, you know. And so even though there may be consequences at some times for following that path, again, I think where we net out is a much better place.
Interesting. Chris, I just want to thank you so much for spending your time and speaking to us today. You know, it's really important that we get these lessons out, but more importantly, hearing directly from you. So we really appreciate you being part of this project.
Thank you, brother. Appreciate it.
Thank you. All right.
So, brother, I have a question. I get to do this. What reservoir do you draw strength from? What keeps you moving forward, even in the face of adversity?
I think there's just like a very human keep going-ness to it. I think that there's, I remember actually that same grandfather out in Jamaica, he's like 93, I think, and he's a salty old man. Like, it was not roses and rainbows with him. He talked shit about everything. As he said, he had outlived most of his friends. So one time I kind of got up the courage to ask him, like, what keeps you going? Because he had every ailment known to man. He didn't present very happy. So what, and his response was this. He said, boy, you just keep, and he didn't really have the words for it. That was it. So I was like, wow. So I think that there is just something in us that seeks life in most times, and then layered on top of that, I think it's people as community, whether it be my 10-year-old godson that I don't know what's coming in his lifetime, but I can't just curl up in a ball and give up the ghosts, knowing that he's trying to navigate that. I draw strength from my elders and ancestors and think about, wow, my day was hard at work today. Like, what were some of these folks going through? I think of my homies who are in parallel spots, and you know, I will get on a trail and be able to rap with a brother, and we may not come up with any solutions, but just being heard and hearing, and that, again, and knowing this is not just me alone, because I think that is one of the, and whether it's like an orchestrated tool or whether it's how it works out, we could debate, but like that isolation, that individualism, that nihilism, that it just won't work, and that serves the division, that serves the capitalism that oppresses us, you know. So there's like, and I wonder if my grandpa had part of that, just spite. Like, yeah, I was supposed to die years and years ago, and like, I'm just gonna keep rocking. And so whether it's the beautiful moments or the angry moments, like I know my spirit's still lit because I still react emotionally. You know, I get upset, I get frustrated, I get happy, and so I think trying to just do the things and surround myself with the people that bring that out feels important to keep the wind in the sails and keep moving forward.
I hear that. Well, thank you again, for sharing your thoughts and the wisdom that's been imparted to you, and which you have been and still plan to share with others. So we appreciate you.
I know.
Yeah.
All right.
Baba Cole?
Good.
Not great, but good.